So I have heard that the recording is on, therefore you can hear us. And welcome to everyone who has joined us today at a regular event conducted by the Center of Economic Strategy. We do monthly reviews of the economy that we were launched in the year 2022 as the reviews of military economy. Unfortunately, we still do this, though definitely we would like to switch to the economy of peaceful times. Our today's topic is how fuel crisis or the war in Iran will affect the Ukrainian economy. We've got great speakers with us today, and I'm the moderator of today's event. I'm Maria Repko, the Deputy Director of the Center for Economic Strategy, and I'm happy to welcome all of you here at our presentation.
For those of you who want to listen to our presentation and the discussion in English, please, you could use the English translation. It's available in the bottom panel of Zoom. Також в Zoom всі, хто хочуть, можуть знайти кнопку для Q&A.
And also you
Туди
can
можна,
find
власне,
the Q&A
почати задавати
button
ваші
down on the
питання.
Zoom
І
panel.
сподіваюся,
Can
що
ask
отримали всі
questions, and
відповіді,
hopefully you will
власне,
get
під
answers
час
from the
презентації та
presenters and
дискусії
those participating in the
за нашими
discussion.
судячи
We are funded
програмою
by
міжнародного
the
розвитку Уряду Великобританії, UK
FCDO and
International
UK
Development.
International Development,
Висловлені думки
and
ніяк
this
не
is the
відображають
event
офіційну
funded by
позицію британського уряду, а
them,
є так
but
само
here is the
якісь позиції
disclaimer that
висловлює.
we will
Отже, як я вже сказала,
use our
презентація
own
сьогодні
opinions and they
проходитиме
do not
в
represent the opinion
двох
of the British
частинах. Традиційна
government.
презентація
They do
від
not
Нацбанку
necessarily
економіки
represent
та
their
огляд
views.
спеціальної
We
теми
will
буде від Economic
focus on
Access.
the presentations by the
Зафіксуватиметься
economists of the Center for
елементарно
Economic
секторі соціальної
Strategy, and it
політики,
will
а
be
також
related to the humanitarian policy,
секторальній
sectoral
динаміці.
dynamics,
Ну,
and
а
then we
потім ми
will
почнемо з вами
start
експерти
our
обговорення
expert
і буде сесія
discussion. There will be
запитань
a
та
Q&A
відповідей. І
session,
сьогоднішні
and
спікери
our
наші, з якими
international
я говоритиму
speakers
про вплив
with
Ірану на економіку
will be the
країни,
speakers with
це
whom
Володимир
we will
Лепушинський,
start the
заступник
discussion.
голови
This is
Національного банку
Volodymyr
України, Наталя
Lepushynskyi,
Шпygотська,
Deputy
це
Head of the National
аналітичне
Bank of Ukraine,
агентство, це
and
великий
Natalia
український інвестиційний банк,
Kolesnichenko
і Олег
from Dragon
Хоменко.
Capital,
Олег,
and Oleh
генеральний директор
Khomenko,
Асоціації
General
українських
Director of the
агропаграрних
Ukrainian
бізнесу.
Club of
Власне, ці навколо
Agrarian
ситуації в
Business.
Ірані
So this
вплинула
is the area
дуже
and the
серйозно.
sector which has been
Отже,
heavily
давайте
affected by the war in
починати.
Iran. So
Я
let me
прошу
start and
слова
let me give the
команді
floor
ЦЕС і
to
Максима
Maxim
Самбалюка,
Samaluk,
який
the
представить огляд
Center for Economic
гуманітарного
Strategies team, and
сектору.
he will provide an overview of the monetary sector.
Дякую,
Thank you,
Марія.
Maria.
Вітаю
Welcome to
всіх
everyone, to
глядачів,
all those
слухачів
who are
нашої сьогоднішньої
present at
події.
our today's
Почнемо з
event, and we'll start
монетарного
with the
сектору,
monetary
що
sector to see what
відбулося
has happened there
за
over the
останній
recent months.
місяць і
So let
почнемо
us start
з
with
цін.
prices.
А ціни
Fuel
зросли на
prices
1,7% в
increased by
порівнянні з попереднім місяцем
1.7% as
або на
compared with the
7,9%
previous
більше за минулий.
months, or
І
they
тут
or
помітний
rather
внесок
0.7
відіграло
and
ПДВ.
7.9
А власне 0,7
percent of
процентних
inflation
пунктів
rate was something
майже
that we
десята
witnessed.
частина всього зростання,
And
і
the
ціни на
prices of
пальне
fuel
зростали
were
найшвидше.
the
У
fastest to
березні воно
increase.
було
In
майже на
March,
чверть дорожче,
fuel
ніж
became
рік тому.
almost a quarter more
Подібне
expensive than a
річне
year
зростання ми вже
before.
бачили влітку
However, a
2023
similar
року, і
increase
це
took place in
відображено
the
на
summer of
слайді
2024, and you
правильному
can see the
графіку.
graph
Але
at the
причини
right.
тоді були
But the
кардинально
reasons there
іншими.
were absolutely
Тоді
different because there the
головною
main reason
причиною
for
такого
this
річного
annual growth
зростання було
was
повернення податку на пальне
repayment
ще у
of the
2023
taxes, of the
році.
fuel
У
taxes
2024 році
back in
після новини ми
2023. That's
бачили
why, if we
якраз таки це
characterize the year
зростання. Але в
2024, we saw this
місячному
growth, but in the
порівнянні
monthly
ціни тоді
comparison, the
майже не
prices were
змінилися.
almost the same.
Зараз, у
Now, in
березні
March
26 року,
2026,
пальне
the
за місяць
fuel
зросло аж
prices
на
increased by 13%
13%.
over a month,
І
and the
головна
main
причина
cause
якраз
definitely
таки
is
війна
the
в
war in
Ірані,
Iran,
зростання цін
increase of oil
нафти, а
prices,
ніяк не якісь
and
адміністративні
there were
чинники
no
або введення.
administrative or
І
regulation
сьогодні, власне,
factors
ми
involved in
детально
that. Therefore, today we will be
обговорюватимемо
discussing the
наслідки війни
consequences
в
of the war
Ірані,
in Iran
паливної
and
кризи
the
на українську
consequences of the
економіку не
fuel
тільки на ціни.
crisis, not just in terms of prices, but in terms
Але
of the
що ми
economy in
вже
general.
бачимо
What
в
do we see
монетарному
in the
секторі?
monetary
У
sector? In
відповідь на
response
підвищену
to accelerated
інфляцію НБУ
inflation, the National Bank
залишив
of
у
Ukraine in
березні
March
відсоткову ставку на
capped the
рівні
policy rate at
15%.
15%.
Раніше
It used to be
Нацбанк
the case
планував
that the National
пом'якшувати
Bank
цю
intended to
політику і
soften its
поступово
policy and to
зменшити
reduce the
ставку
policy
впродовж
rate
року
up to
до 14,5%
14.5%
з
over the
відсотків.
year. But
Тепер ці
now the
плани більше
plan
не
is no
актуальні.
longer relevant. The policy rate or the accounting rate is the main tool of the national bank using which it affects inflation, and it also affects the lending percentage. And the refusal from decreasing the rate will mean that credits will not be becoming less expensive, and this refers to all types of credits. Recently, we've had an event dedicated to the development of lending market in Ukraine, but unfortunately now the inflation pressure comes as more important for the economy in general, and it's really important to regulate the inflation and to keep it, to curb it within some adequate figures in order to finally get it back to the target indicator of 5%, while now inflation has reached 7.9% annually. The war in Iran has also affected the Ukrainian currency and gold reserves. In March, they um, decreased, but the amount is still enough. That's still a high level, but it's of interest that the reserves reduced for many reasons, including the decrease in the gold prices. Over the recent months, starting with the end of 2025, gold has been a kind of a safe haven for investment from all over the world. It was a rather attractive sector, and gold prices were increasing. However, the war in Iran um, made investment into Ukrainian economy more attractive. Therefore, the demand for uh, gold went down, and this led to the decline in gold prices, this affecting Ukrainian gold and currency reserves. Uh, Gold constitutes almost 7% of all the Ukraine's international reserves as of the 1st of April 2026. Now, gold prices are increasing, therefore this is contributed to, this is kind of for by the expectations that the war in Iran will end soon. That's all for me. Let me give the floor to my colleagues.
Так,
Thank you.
дякую. І ми
And we will
перейдемо
now
до
go over to the
аналізу
analysis of the
фіскального
fiscal
сектору.
sector. I hope that you
Давайте
can see my
переходимо.
screen.
І так, і почнемо ми
And we will
традиційно з
traditionally start with
аналізу
analysis
дохідної
of the
частини
revenue part of
нашого
our
бюджету. Загальний
budget. The overall
висновок
conclusion in the short
таковий, що субсидії
term
зараз в березні
is that now in
криза,
March
палива
we
криза мала
had the fuel
обмежений
crisis
вплив
that
на
had a
доходи
limited
державного
impact on
бюджету.
the revenues to the
Загалом
budget.
в
All in
березні
all,
цього
in March
року
this
ми
year,
зібрали
we
податками до
got
загального фонду
through
державного бюджету
taxes the
близько
revenues of about
244 мільярдів
244
гривень,
billion
що
hryvnias,
на
which
30
is
мільярдів більше, ніж
30
в
billion
березні минулого року.
more
І
than
що
in
важливо
March
тут є
of the
те,
previous
що
year. And it's important that
половина
half of
цього
this growth
зростання була
came from
забезпечена збільшенням
input
надходжень
VAT.
від імпортного ПДВ.
Why
Чому
did it
так
happen
сталося?
so?
В
The point is
березні
that in March,
надходження від
revenues from
нафтопродуктів
petroleum products,
в цілому, так, в березні
or let me
нафтопродукти,
rephrase
товарообіг
it, in
із
March,
нафтопродуктів
petroleum
витрати
products
склали 21 мільярд гривень,
worth
і
21
це
billion
на 3,8 мільярдів
were
більше місяць
imported,
до місяця,
which is
що спричинено збільшенням
3.8 billion
потреби
more
в
in the months to
наших
months
запасах, а також
correlation due
підвищеними
to
цінами
increase
на ці
in
нафтопродукти.
reserves for fuel
Якщо ми
and
подивимося на
higher
внутрішнє
prices. But
ПДВ,
if we have a
надходження
look
від
at
внутрішнього ПДВ,
domestic VAT
непротиваго воно
revenues,
зменшилось
it
як на
decreased
місяць до
both
місяця, так
month of
і з
month
рік
and
до року.
year
Здебільшого
due
це
to
спричинено
the
більшим
growth
відшкодуванням
in
внутрішнього
budget
ПДВ
refunds and
замість
greater input reliance.
єдиного надходження. Що
As far as
стосується прямого
direct
оподаткування,
taxation is
то
concerned, the
надходження
revenues
від
from
податку на доходи
the
фізичних осіб та податку на
profit
прибуток
and
перевиконали
income
план, а також зросли рік до
increase the
року.
plan and
Про що
also
це
increase
говорить? Це говорить про
as
те,
compared in the
що в березні
year-to-year
вплив на ці
perspective, which means
податки
that
був обмежений,
the influence
і
of the
проте
crisis in March on
варто
those
думати про
taxes
те,
was
що
rather
в
limited, but we need to
майбутньому
think about what
і
is going to happen in the
світ,
future
і паливна
and how
криза
far
вплине на
is the
економічні
fuel
очікування.
crisis going to
Враховуючи
affect
це, ми
economic
можемо очікувати,
expectations. We may
що в
well
наступні
expect
місяці
that in the nearest
надходження
months,
від
the
цих
revenues
податків
coming from
будуть
those
зменшені
taxes will be
якраз
lower
через ці
because
гірші
of those
економічні
worse
очікування.
economic
Що також
expectations.
цікавого
What
відбулося в
else has
березні?
happened in
В
March?
березні
In March, we used almost the entire reserve fund, and the overall goal of the reserve fund is to, if needed, of course, use the state budget for some unexpected expenditures to cover them. And by unexpected expenditures, we mean something that could not be let down in the budget. And the overall amount was for the year 49.4 billion hryvnias for the overall budget of 2026. But only in March, 96% of the reserve fund were used. And we think that actually most of the money could have been envisaged in the plan for the year 2026 and budgeted in the overall state budget expenditures, because most of the expenditures were the expenditures used to protect critical infrastructure. Also, this was covering of the deficit with the Ukrainian railway, which was mentioned in a lot of discussions last year. Also, the money was used for road maintenance, and it is the issue of planning the maintenance of roads. Which means that most of the money could have been budgeted, and we shouldn't have used the reserve fund for this. And let us also speak about the total expenditures from the state budget in February this year. The total expenditures increased 372 billion hryvnias, which is plus 30% month-on-month, which means 30% more than in January this year. And this came as nothing new, because normally in January, year of year, we have the lowest total expenditures, and then the expenditures are rising throughout the year. Therefore, this increase didn't come as a surprise. Mainly, the expenditures went to cover war needs out of the internal resources and some assistance coming from the outside. And as far as non-military spendings are concerned, we can see the highest increase in the expenditures to cover economic activity. In particular, this is due to the funds allocated to National Development Institution, and also there was an increase in the expenditure on road debt repayments and healthcare. But in general, non-military spendings didn't show uniform dynamics. If we have a look at other spendings, they actually did not change month of month. They even went down if we have a look at the annual dynamics, because total expenditures fell by 10% year over year, and this happened both for war-related expenditures and for no war-related expenditures. They all declined. That's all from me. Let me give the floor to my colleague. Welcome, dear colleagues. So, our today's meeting aimed to discuss what is now happening and what impact of the fuel crisis in the Middle East we see, how the increase in oil and gas prices have affected Ukraine. We decided not to show this impact on different slides, but to make this overview, because this is something that really affects all the sectors of the economy. So let us start, as usual, with the energy situation, which improved in March. As stated last time, there was almost no deficit. There were almost no deficits. They were only situational, which means that we could improve electricity import by 25%, and we also got the electricity exports resumed about 30 gigawatt hours in some hours. However, the situation in the energy system still remains very vulnerable and unstable. Partly, this is connected to the regulatory decisions of the government. In particular, we know that from the 1st of April, NORC canceled PSOs for one-time generation of power and reduced price caps. That's why production of cogeneration facilities was not sufficient to keep the stable situation. And since since the prices in the internal market were rather low because of the reduced price caps, some restrictions again came into effect for households and for industrial enterprise.
Почався також і ремонт атомних
Also, they
станцій, і,
started
на
repairing
жаль,
nuclear
ми
power
ще досі
plants, and unfortunately,
спостерігаємо
even
про
now
те,
we can
що
see that
обстріли
the shelling
і
is still
природних
there.
прийому, і
The
частково
missiles,
енергетичної
missile
інфраструктури
attacks and drone
газового
attacks,
тривають.
both against Ukraine in general
Міністерство
and of the energy
енергетики
infrastructure, is still everything is still
повідомило
there.
про те, як ми
The Ministry of
пройшли
Energy has provided a
опалювальний сезон,
report
який був
on
дуже
how
складним
we
цього
managed to
року.
go through
Зокрема,
this
вони сказали про
difficult
те, що
heating
було
season. In particular, they
збудовано 9
mentioned that
гігават-генерацій
9
і
gigawatts of
станом до грудня
generation were
відновлено 4, майже
destroyed, and
половина.
almost half of them
Через
were
те, що
repaired by the
найкращі
1st of
цієї
April. A
генерації
major
це
share comes from
ГЕС, то ми бачили також
ICPs or rather
доволі високі
combined
залишки
heat
газу
power
в
plants,
газових сховищах,
CHPs. Also, we
майже
saw
10
almost
мільярдів
10
кубічних метрів. Ну, з
billion cubic
урахуванням
meters of
електричний добуток у
gas
нас становить
storage,
17
and
мільярдів
with production
кубічних
of
метрів
17
газу.
billion cubic
Можливо,
meters,
Україні не потрібно
probably
буде дуже
Ukraine
високий імпорт
uh,
газу цього року.
will
Він
need to
може бути
import
близько 1
only
мільярда кубічних метрів,
about 1 billion cubic
хоча це
meters,
дасть змогу досягти
though
тільки
it will
13
help us to
мільярдів кубічних
reach
метрів на
only 13 billion
початок
cubic
опалювального
meters in
сезону.
storage before
Якщо
November,
країна
before the beginning of
вважатиме,
the
а це
heating
було б доцільно,
season.
нам
And
треба
if Ukraine
більше,
thinks
хоча
that
б
it would be
15
expedient to have more, at least
мільярдів
15
кубометрів, то ми
billion cubic
маємо
meters, we will
імпортувати
have to
близько
import
3.
about 3.
Для
For the
енергетичного
energy
сектору
sector,
вплив
the
війни
effect
в
of the
Ірані це
war in
насамперед
Iran is all
ціни.
about prices,
Досі
because oil
нафта
price
відповідно
is
дорожча за
rising,
риночний,
fuel
виробляється
prices are
дорожче, і газ використовуємо
increasing, the
виробництво
gas as a
електроенергії.
resource for
Відповідно,
power
може бути
production,
дорожчою
power
і
generation
внутрішня
is also
електроенергія,
becoming
і
more expensive.
електроенергія, яку ми
And this
імпортуємо.
holds true both
Важливо
for our
також дуже
domestic
і
energy and for
доступність
imported
ресурсів.
energy.
Якщо
It's also
ми не
important to
матимемо
mention limited
достатньо
resources supply.
газу
If we
на
don't have
зовнішньому
sufficient
ринку
gas
або СПГ,
reserves in
або
the external market
європейських
coming from
постачальників, то
European
ціни на нього
suppliers
будуть
or
дуже високими, і ми не зможемо
entrepreneurs,
імпортувати
the
навіть
prices
той
will
необхідний обсяг,
remain high,
який
and we
потрібно,
will
нам
not
потрібно імпортувати
manage
цього
to
року.
import even the small
Наступний слайд,
scope
будь
that we
ласка.
will need. Next slide, please.
Те, що
The fact
енергетична
that
ситуація була
energy
стабільною
situation
доволі
was rather
стабільною в
stable
березні,
in
нас
March
привело до різкого
has led to
збільшення оптимізму
much
українських
more
підприємств. Ми
optimistic
це бачимо по
expectations among
опитуваннях
Ukrainian companies. We can
Національного
see it
банку,
judging by
як
their
щомісячних, так
quarterly and
і
monthly surveys
щоквартальних. Обидва
conducted by the
індекси
National
суттєво
Bank.
зросли.
You can see two
Сезон обслуговування
indexes
мобільної
where
щомісячно
their
на
figures
34% це ще
increased.
нейтрального
One of
рівня,
them still
але
remains under the
фактичні
neutral
дані
level,
вони
but
вже
the
перевищили
actual
нейтральний рівень.
data has
Це
already
свідчить про те, що підприємства
exceeded
в
the
березні
neutral level,
відчували
which means
себе
that
доволі
companies were
впевнено.
rather confident about their
Водночас
future in
за цим
March.
опитуванням квартального,
But
яке я
in the
згадала,
quarterly
підприємства
business
зазначають
expectations index
суттєвий
survey,
вплив
the
погіршення
companies mentioned
ситуації на
that there
паливному
is a
ринку на їх діяльність. Тобто вони кажуть, що це
serious
впливає
impact of
на їх
deteriorations in the
вихідні
fuel
ціни
market on
і
their
також
activity because
обмежує їх
this limits
подальше
their
нарощення обсягів
further
виробництва.
scaling of
Можливо, це
production. Maybe
погіршення
this
базової
improvement
погіршення
of
показників
figures and
очікувань
expectations
були
and business
впевнені ще
confidence
у
in March
березні, свідчить про
testifies
те,
to the
що
fact that
економічна
economic
активність у березні
activity
послабилась.
in
Відповідно,
March
це може
became
компенсувати той
more
глибокий
active,
спад
more became
економіки,
stronger,
який
and
міг
this make
спостерігатися у
well
перші два
compensate
місяці
for the
року
decline in the
саме
economy of the
через
first 2 months of the
нестачу
year that
електроенергії.
took place because of the lack of
Зокрема, Міністерство
power. In
електроенергії,
particular, the
Міністерство
Ministry of
економіки повідомило,
Economy has
що
mentioned
тарифи
that
пільг
according to their
самоврядування в
estimates, the real
січні-лютому
GDP
становило
in March and February fell by
1,2% річного
1.2%
виробу.
year of
В
year.
основному це
This
відбулося
mainly
за рахунок
happened
того, що
because
падало виробництво в енергетичному
production
секторі,
in generation in the
виробництво
energy sector was
також
going
забрало
down. The
оберт через обстріли дуже
freight
скоротився.
circulation and
Спотворилася
turnover
подача
also went
можливостей.
down
Хоча
because
за
of the
деякими
shelling, and the
видами
situation in the
енергетичного
industry was
середовища
also
зростання,
rather
зокрема в
difficult.
харчовій
Though even in
промисловості.
February and
У
January we
лютому
saw some
поліпшилися
increase, in particular in the food
теплові та
industry,
машинне
and in
устаткування,
February
але
also the
незначно.
machine building
Для
worked
загалом для
better,
економічної
slightly better
активності
than before. It should be mentioned that the risks coming from this fuel crisis and shortage of resources are related to the fact that oil and gas constitute an important raw material for many types of economic activity, in particular for industrial activity. Therefore, high prices and shortage of resources will lead to higher production expenditures and will limit the scope of production, as companies already mentioned their expectations. And definitely, transportation costs will become higher, and that will lead to high inflation. Next slide, please. According to the operational indicators, we can see that in the metallurgy industry, the situation in March improved, and overall metallurgical production grew by 20-40% as compared to February, depending on the specific product. Therefore, the situation somehow stabilized and it's no longer as critical as it was at the beginning of the year. Though we still have it as an issue for Ukrainian metallurgy, how CBAM measures will be introduced. These are additional duties of the EU on import goods with a high carbon emission. For Ukrainian metallurgy, it's quite a high duty. It's about 60 euros per 1 ton of products. Therefore, since the amount of duty and the amount of emission is something that is not yet settled, European customers cancel some of their orders, and now companies claim that about 1 million tons of orders have been cancelled, and this may potentially lead to the dismissal of a lot of employees and stopping of production facilities because the domestic market has a share of 60% only. For metallurgy, it's the same as for other export-oriented industries. The main risks resulting from the war in Iran and fuel crisis consist in the fact that the global economy growth may become slower, and therefore the demand for our export goods will be lower than it used to be. Next slide, please. The spring sowing season has begun across all regions at the same pace as last year. It goes along the plans and along the estimates given before by a lot of experts. Sowing is already there in all the regions, and the winter crops are also in good condition, but for a part of Ukraine where there was not enough snow cover and there was a high level of frost this year. Quite well, we may assess the moisture reserves in soil. So actually the prospects for this year's harvest and yield are rather good. But it's not that simple because agrarians can feel the impact of the fuel crisis and definitely they bought fertilizers and fuel long before the sowing campaign, but partly increased fuel prices, in particular diesel prices. When diesel, as you know, became about 30 hryvnias or even 50% more expensive than at the beginning of the year, and increased prices of fertilizers do already have an impact on the current spring sowing season. Though the government has told that it supports agricultural producers with the same programs that were in effect last year, this is like compensation of the part of the cost of agricultural machinery, reimbursement. Also, agricultural insurance was introduced, and 60 billion hryvnias were allocated for that. And there is also humanitarian demining. Whether it's sufficient, we will still speak about that with our guests. As far as the risks for the agricultural sector are concerned, these are a shortage of fertilizers because of their high cost, smaller amounts of fertilizers used, applied, and therefore this may negatively impact the need. which will mean that we will have lower yield, and this will affect processing and export, which means that along all the added value chains, this may have a negative impact on the Ukrainian economy. And what is even more important, lower yield means that there will be higher inflation pressure, not only for wheats and corn that are produced by our agricultural producers and that require fertilizers. We already saw it in the last years that lower yield accelerates inflation in the conditions of significant demand and quite a share of food, quite a high share of food in the consumer basket of our households. Please, the next slide. The first evaluations regarding the impact of the fuel crisis on Ukrainian companies have already been shared by the European Business Association. Companies actually participated in the survey, and at the end of March, where the survey was conducted, only 9% of enterprises had not felt that there had been any impact. 60% reported very high level of impact, which is a very high figure. At the moment, they claim that this is mostly the impact in terms of prices, and 70% have stated that what increased was logistics and transportation costs, and mainly the increase was up to 10%. 50% have said that they have not faced any increase in their activity. 20% of companies have already experienced that the increase in the production costs, and they have already transported it, like shifted it onto the shoulders of consumers. And 40% can maintain current prices for only 1 or 2 months or less, and then they will have to increase their prices. Therefore, inflation risks are increasing for all types of goods and services because all of them contain a fuel component. They need to transport raw materials to the production site, or they need to transport finished commodities to shops, or to do any other sort of supply. And this all involves transportation and will definitely affect the overall level of prices. Next slide, please. We can also see that 20% of businesses failed to assess the level of impact. They said that it is too early. And this high level of uncertainty refers not only to businesses, it also refers to the IMF. Normally, the practice of scenario development for Ukraine by the IMF is something that we all lend an attentive ear to. They try to focus on the scenarios with due account of the end of hostilities or ceasefire, and this definitely affects the economy and requires a different level of support for us that could be provided by the IMF together with partners. This time, in its updated World Economic Outlook in April, the IMF published four forecasts related to the development of the global economy, depending on what will happen in the Middle East. And they called the first scenario the baseline scenario, and they expect then the supply will happen in the middle of the year. The second scenario is adverse scenario, which presupposes a more long-lasting increase in fuel prices and energy prices. Then we have the reference scenario, or actually severe scenario in orange, according to which the energy infrastructure in the Middle East will be majorly affected, which will mean that supplies will shrink as compared to the previous scenarios. And for comparison purposes, they also developed this scenario for the global economy in case the war was not there. So the risks in all scenarios are more on the side of deterioration of the situation. Than GDP growth will not be that quick as compared to the previous forecast, and inflation will be much higher depending on the specific scenario.
Why will there be a slowdown in global economy? Because high prices and shortage of resources may be related to a very wide range of sectors for which fuel is the core raw material. We normally think that oil is only about fuel, about energy, but no. Plastic, fertilizers, polymers, different synthetic materials, food additives, cosmetic agents, a lot of construction materials, pharmaceutical products, other things that actually manufactured with the use of fuel, rather petroleum and gas. Therefore, high prices and problems with supply of those resources will lead to decline in production, lower demand, and lower level of customers' satisfaction. Therefore, we can really see very high risks of non-acceleration or slowing down of the global economy. The IMF also says that high inflation and acceleration in the economic development will primarily take place in the markets that are developing, that do import of fuel resources and that are already vulnerable. Definitely, that's also about Ukraine. While well-developed economies will have a non-revised forecast, there are only minor changes, and the impact of the fuel crisis on them will be much less significant. An important channel for a unfavored impact on Ukraine is reduction in the external demand for our main goods that are designed for export because of the slowdown in the economies of the countries that are our main economic partners, as well as the pressure of inflation um, in foreign countries on and its impact on the situation in Ukraine, in particular because of higher prices for imported goods we depend on. For us, this means unfavorable impact on economic activity, prices, and exchange rate. The IMF has already published some anti-crisis recommendations for governments, recommending how they could preserve price and financial stability and recommending certain policies. While generally these recommendations are rather traditional, they should preserve price and financial stability, safeguard fiscal sustainability, and implement structural reforms without further delays. Central banks must anchor inflation expectations. At the same time, the IMF, and it came as an interesting fact for me, the IMF also allows targeted assistance for vulnerable groups alongside fiscal, structural, and industrial policies to remove domestic distortions. The IMF expects that this sort of well-balanced policies of the national governments will support economic growth globally. Ukrainian companies, in their turn, expect from the Ukrainian government to apply a more flexible tax policy, in particular, introduction of some alleviations in the periods of major price fluctuations. So mostly they are talking about reduction of excise duties on fuel in the period of growing prices, ensuring transparency in the fuel market. Well, I could not comment what companies really mean by that. And also, they have a demand from the government for supporting the sectors for which fuel is a major component of expenditures. So, mainly, we are talking about agriculture here. Therefore, further expansion and embracing, at least with the 579 preferential lending program for this spring sowing season would be a very good thing. Thank you for attention.
Дуже дякую,
Thank you,
Наталія,
Natalia, for
за
your
цю
presentation.
презентацію. Дійсно, виглядає
The
ситуація
situation
зовсім
really
загрозливою.
looks
Ми
very dangerous for
знаходимося в
Ukraine.
вразливому
We are
стані через
vulnerable because
війну,
of
в
the war,
вразливому стані
because
через
of
те,
the
що
fact that
Україна
Ukraine
імпортує багато
imports a lot of
пального,
fuel,
ну і
and
через інший
because
пакет
of some
проблем.
other
Такий
problems.
швидкий рекап.
Therefore,
Ми
well, here is my quick recap. We mentioned that fuel increased prices. Inflation in March was almost 8%, and there was a 13% increase in the fuel prices. Therefore, the inflation risks increased, and that is not yet the end to all that. Therefore, we may stop having those expectations about reduced policy rate from the National Bank. That was said by the economist of the center, Maxim Samolyuk. Alexandra Mironenko shared the information about the impact of this crisis and war on the revenues to the Ukrainian budgets and the expenditures from the Ukrainian budget. And Natalia Kolesnichenko, senior economist of the Center of Economic Strategy, also covered the impact of the war in Iran on a number of factors in the Ukrainian economy. And now I would like to go over to our discussion. We have invited Volodymyr Lepushynskyi, who is the deputy head of the National Bank of Ukraine, Natalia Shpygotska, senior analyst of Dragon Capital, and Oleh Khomenko, CEO of the Association Ukrainian Club of Agrarian Business. And my first question will be for
Володимир, як представник Нацбанку, інституції, яка має свої прогнози
you are the
економічного
representative of the
зростання.
National Bank, which is the central authority having its own growth plans, and I'm sure that you have already made some assessment of this war and its impact. Natalia said that the impact will be negative because we are importers, we are vulnerable, we are in a bad situation.
Як на думку Нацбанку, що вже
And what
реалізувалося?
does the National Bank think of that? What sectors have already been affected? What impact there has been on the inflation rate? And you remember, Natalia showed us several scenarios for the global economy. So which of the scenarios do you consider to be more likely, and which scenarios you take for your own forecast for further development of events? Volodymyr, over to you.
Вітаю.
Yes,
Я,
welcome
власне,
to everyone. Well, I
погоджуюсь,
would
що
agree
дійсно вплив є
that
значним.
really the impact
І по
is a
інфляції
major
вплив
one,
ми
and we have
вже
unfortunately
бачили.
already seen the
Він
impact on
був близько
inflation,
до того, що ми
which
оцінювали
was
в березні.
close
Тобто, по
to
факту, інфляція за
what
березень
we
вже враховувала первинні ефекти зростання цін на
expected
пальне, яку
as
очікували
based on
експерти.
the increase in the
Це
food
був
fuel
до
prices.
річної інфляції
According
порівняно з
to
нашим
our
прогнозом. Тобто,
estimates and
якщо
calculations,
підтримуємо
so there
наші
has been an
прогнози,
increase
ми
by 4% as compared to the
очікували,
previous
що
forecast. We
інфляційний
expected that
тренд
the inflation
розвернеться
trend
ближче до
will
середини
come
року.
to the
Ми
front
вже по факту
somewhere
мали розгортання
in
цього
the middle
тренду.
of the year, but
Нас
now
інфляція
we
7,9,
already have this
березні
trend of
порівняно з 7,5
inflation rise because already in March it's 7.9.
в лютому. Хоча в інших показниках ми були близькі до того, що прогнозували.
Though, as far as other indicators were concerned, we were rather close to reality in our forecast. That's why we can see that the inflation is higher, mainly because of the war in the Middle East. Generally, according to our estimates, the impact of increased prices, I mean, direct impact may run from 0.5 to 1.5%, while the secondary effects may be twice higher, which means that inflation can be about 2% higher than in the scenario without the war in the Middle East. But we could not just take those figures and add them up to our January forecast and get the forecast for December, because that doesn't work that way. There are a number of other factors. In particular, it also depends on the budget restrictions because the expenditures are on the rise, and this may respectively adjust the demand, influence the demand, and thus reduce the price pressure. But this is just one of the examples of such factors. Therefore, we would need to have a comprehensive analysis of all factors, and I think that on the 30th of April, we will show the findings of our analysis, and then on the 7th of May, we will produce a report, in particular report on inflation. As far as pressure on the trade balance is concerned, higher expenditures on import of gas and petroleum products because of the price rise, well, they will be high, but that may be about 1.5 billion higher.
І також здорожчає імпорт
And
добрив.
import of fertilizers will also be more expensive.
Це
According to our
невідомо багато
estimates, it's
порівняно
about
з 1,5
140
років,
million.
наприклад, 2
Well, this is
мільярдами, однак це
seemingly
стосується одного
not that
сектору.
much. This is millions, not that much as compared
Загальних новин,
with
що частково
the
експорт,
forecast,
активний
but
експорт
still,
виступлять як певних
it
компенсатор,
refers to only one sector, so
бо
it's
в
going to be a
нас
major impact.
те, що ми
As far as
експортуємо,
export
це
is concerned, we mainly
продовольство,
export
попит на нього
food,
є майже
and the
незалежний від ціни.
demand is not that much dependent on
Однак
the
це
price,
вартість
but the
зростає
prime
у всіх
cost
виробників глобально,
rises with
відповідно,
all manufacturers. Therefore, there will
зростатиме
be an
ціна
increase
на
in
продукти нашого
prices
експорту.
for
Ми вже по факту бачимо,
our
що ціни
uh,
на
export.
продукцію
We can see
металургії
that the prices for
високі.
metallurgical goods are already
Оскільки
higher
випали з ланцюжків
because the countries of the Middle East have fallen out of
і
the
це
supply
також
chains,
може
and
бути
this
певним
may act
компенсатором.
as a
Прямий
certain
вплив на ВВП є
compensator.
обмеженим.
The
Він
direct impact on
проявлятиметься переважно
GDP
через зростання
is
виробничих
limited. It will
витрат.
be mainly manifested in the
Проте можуть
growth
бути,
of
звичайно, спотворінні ефекти. Це як безпековий
manufacturing costs, but
вимір,
there
оскільки
could also be
виснажуються запаси зброї
security
необхідні
considerations
нам.
because the
Це
reserves of
фінансовий
weapons
стан
are
агресора,
no
оскільки його
longer there.
спроможність фінансувати
Also,
війну
the financial
біднішою за
status of the
агресорську-покупців.
aggressor
Ну і
is
глобальні
something
монетарні
we need to
умови,
take into account because it has
де
more money
центральні
to
банки
finance the war.
реагуватимуть або не
And
будуть
central
зростати
banks
активи,
will
що було
respond, they
раніше, або
will
збільшуватимуть їх.
decrease or
І
increase
відповідно
the
це
rates, and that
також
will
ризик охолодження світової
also affect
економіки.
the global economy.
Але в нас є
However,
чинники,
we do
які
have some
нівелюють цей
factors
вплив.
to
Це стійкість
measure this
фінансування,
impact.
оскільки
This
ми, на
is
відміну від інших
funding sustainability
ринкових
because,
економік,
unlike
у
other
нас
market
не мала
economies, we are
залежності
not
від
that much dependent on the
світової ціни
global
капіталу.
capital price.
В нас це переважно
Mainly,
залежить від політичних
this
домовленостей,
is
також
something that depends on
наша
political
структура
agreements and our
експорту,
export
яка
structure,
переважно
which
стала
has mainly
нееластичною за
become
ціною,
non-elastic in terms of
виходячи з те, що ми
prices
виробляємо. Крім того, в
because of
майбутньому
the
ця
range of goods
продукція у
that we
верхах
produce. And
потреба в ній лише зростатиме.
then if we speak
Відповідно,
about the
перспективно ми
military
можемо на цьому ринку також
sector,
достатньо
the
активно
demand will be
експортувати.
higher, which means that we may
Отже,
have active
глобальне
exports.
охолодження–
So
це
global
негативний
cooling is
фактор і
actually a
ризик
negative
для
factor in the
прогнозу.
risk
Однак
for
це не
our
буде
focus, but
критичним
this
чинником.
is
У
not
нас критичний
going
наш
to
чинник, від
come as a
якого
critical
залежить
factor.
переважно
Our
наше
economic
економічне
growth will
зростання,
mainly
це наша
depend on,
війна.
because the main
Він
factor for us is
започаткувається
our
через
war.
те, що
And
були
de
достатньо
facto,
суттєві
because
удари
of
по нашій
major attacks
енергоінфраструктурі,
against our
тому
energy
через перший
infrastructure,
квартал ми
we can
оцінюємо
state that
як позитивній зоні, однак він, звичайно, що буде
definitely
нижче, ніж те, що ми закладали в наш
our
макроекономічний прогноз
macroeconomic
раніше.
forecast
Ну і щодо
will
прогнозів, то
not be the
наразі
same as
як і
it used
Міжнародний
to be.
валютний
So
фонд,
the
і більшість
figures will
аналістів
be lower than
з
expected.
якості базового
Well, and you
сценарію
mentioned the
беруть
IMF.
сценарій,
So
коли в
normally they
другому
take
кварталі
as
цього
the
року
baseline
ціни
scenario, the
залишатимуться
scenario
на
when
енергоносії високими,
in the second
і
quarter
надалі
this year, the
поступово буде певна
prices will still remain
нормалізація, а
high, but
втім для
then there will
достатньо
be a
тривалий
period of
час
normalizing, which
перед
will
тим, як
still
ціни
take quite a
повернуться
time before
до
prices get
того
back to
рівня,
the
на якому
level
вони були
at
до
which they used to be before the
війни
war in the
на
Middle
території.
East.
І також
And
певні
also,
більш негативні, несприятливі
there is a more
сценарії, якщо
negative
реалізуються
scenario
ризики того, що
if
ціни будуть
prices are
вищими
higher
і
and if
застрягнуть
they
на
stick
цих рівнях
at that
надовше.
level, a higher level for a
Ми,
longer
скоріш за
period of
все,
time.
будемо також закладати аналогічні припущення.
Well,
У нас
this
є
scenario
прогноз,
is also
ми
there.
над ним
We are
працюємо.
still working at
Відповідно,
our
коли буде
forecast.
30-го
That's
квітня,
why we will
опублікуємо.
publish the
Але
basic figures on
слідкуємо
the
як базовий
30th
сценарій,
of
так і на
April,
певні
but we will
альтернативні,
publish both the
або
baseline scenario and
принаймні
some
оцінку
alternative
ризиків
scenarios,
до
or at
базового
least we
сценарію.
will try to assess the risks for this baseline scenario. Thank you, Volodymyr. I think that during our discussion, I will still go back to the security dimension and the impact of the war in the Middle East on this. But now I will invite Natalia Shpygotska, who is the economist and analyst of Dragon Capital, which also has some forecast. And as Natalia Kolesnichenko has mentioned, the war in Iran has a all-penetrating impact because of the polymers and other things. Dragon analyzes what is happening in many different factors. So, Natalia, what is your overall forecast, and how do you assess the impact of the war in Iran on the sectors with which you are directly dealing? And thanks a lot for being with us today. Well, thank you for the question. In general, I cannot but agree with the statements made today about the forecast. Our forecasts are actually close to the forecast of the National Bank regarding the impact of the war in Iran and the fuel crisis on the economy of Ukraine. And our latest forecast for 2026 already take into account the impact of the war. And we expect GDP growth this year to be 1.5%. And as far as the fuel crisis is concerned, we actually don't expect a major effect of increased fuel prices on economic activity unless the turbulence in the world will lead to major shortage of fuel in the country. As far as inflation expectations are concerned, so far, the inflation, according to our forecast at the end of the year, will be 7.1%, and we reconsidered it as compared to the previous forecast in trying to take into account increase in fuel prices and also taking into account what is happening to the exchange rates. And it should be mentioned that our scenario is based on the assumption that over the nearest months, the war or the hostilities in the Middle East will be suspended at least, and this will help the global oil prices to be stabilized and to be at the level of about $70 per barrel. But if they keep being higher, like $100 per barrel over a longer period of time, by the end of the year, this will lead to the risk of inflation rate rising 2% higher than we expect according to our current forecast. As far as the as far as foreign trade is concerned, we expect that actually the situation here will still be like the 25% of GDP. And we also assume that the prices get normalized over the next years. However, if not, this will create additional risks in terms of shortage at the level of $1.4 billion, which definitely is also something that almost coincides with the assessment of the bank. In general, our expectation is that pressure and potential negative consequences for Ukrainian economy will be related to the price pressure. In particular, we don't expect any major negative impact on economic activity. And if we have a look in the sectoral breakdown, growing fuel prices, as already mentioned today in the presentation, have led to increased prices of diesel. As compared with the beginning of the year, the prices have increased about 50%, so like from 60 hryvnias per liter to 90 and something. And this is the first direct impact that we can trace because the transportation costs in all sectors of the economy get higher. If we speak about
assessment of the consumption of fuel resources in Ukraine, well, definitely we don't have the relevant data for clear reasons, but if we have a look at the situation before the war, so this transportation industry consumed about full half of the total amount of diesel consumed in the state, and therefore we may trace a direct impact on the growing transportation costs, and this increases sectors for the cost of all sectors of the economy that have to rely on transportation. If we have a look at the breakdown, the current breakdown of the volume of freight transportation, cargo transportation in Ukraine. So based on the results of the year 2025, we can see that the dominating sector here is railway transportations. It's about 50% of all cargo transportations in the state, and 40% more are transportation by vehicles, motor transport. And we can see that increased diesel prices lead directly to higher transportation costs for the key economic players and for the economies providing transportation services. Though this growth in transportation costs is so far not proportionate to the retail diesel prices increase, but it's still there. On the other hand, if we have a look at railway transportations, which constitute the main component of the transportation sector, we can state that the transportation tariff is regulated by the state. And Ukrainian railway is trying to have a draft decision on the revision of transportation, cargo transportation fees revised and approved. And here we're also talking about the increase in other costs, because Ukrainska Zaleznica, Ukrainian Railways, has some other issues to decide. But I can state that Ukrainska Zaleznica, Ukrainian Railways, cannot fully shift growing transportation costs on to consumers or onto the Ukrainian economy. So the first direct impact is manifested in growing transportation costs. And then if we have a look at agriculture and industry, we can see that transportation costs constitute about 10%, up to 10% of the overall manufacturing and production costs, which is quite a significant share, but not a prevailing element of production costs, and therefore production costs will keep rising, but the impact on the financial results in those industries will not be that significant. However, if high oil prices are still there for a long period of time, and if we already see the secondary effects, which will be growing prices of fertilizers and other components of production costs, this will mean that the higher transportation costs will be reimbursed through shifting the costs onto other sectors or the consumers, and therefore this impact can be even more significant. Thank you, Natalia. Are you with us, or have you disappeared? No, I'm here. Okay, sorry, because I couldn't see you. So thanks a lot. Well, it's really true. I think that this is one of the reasons for spending the money of the reserve fund on the needs of the Ukrainian railways. So this has been mentioned today in the presentation. Thank you, Natalia. Maria, you're muted. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Natalia. So we will get back to you with another question during the discussion. And now let me give the floor to Oleh Khomenko, the CEO of the Ukrainian Club of Agricultural Businesses. Please do respond to my question. Natalia has already said something about the agricultural sector, and she said that 10% of the costs are transportation costs. But maybe you stick to a different opinion. Maybe the percentage is higher or smaller. And how will the war in Iran affect the agricultural sector
sector? This is the first part of my question. On the second part of the question is as follows. You know, Volodymyr said that food prices will go up. We've been told that food prices will definitely go up. What is your expectation? How far can they increase? I mean, food prices increase in Ukraine and in global markets to which we export our goods. So let's consider two components like this. And how far will it compensate the growing production costs for agricultural businesses? Well, thank you. Thank you for your question. Well, for sure, agricultural sector is one of the sectors where full technological operation is related to fuel and lubricating materials like diesel, fuel and lubricants are also very important. And we definitely have the impact on the cost of fertilizers because in the structure of fertilizers production, 90% accounted for by natural gas. Therefore, the direct costs of production in agriculture will be on the rise. Well, we do have some reserve. And our colleagues have already mentioned that we try to buy fertilizers ahead of time, and we try to also provide to buy seeds and to buy crop protecting agents ahead of time. That's why we really did it. We bought diesel fuel at lower prices, but finally we will have to buy some more fuel at higher prices in order to provide for all the measures that we have to take in the field. Well, growing prices by 5 to 10%. Well, this is just an optimistic scenario because we think that it's going to be about 20%. There is some financial reserve from the previous year, which was quite successful from the point of view of financial performance of your agricultural companies. Therefore, in particular, there could be some hedging before the financial situation gets stabilized. And well, if we speak about higher prices, for sure, in the global markets, there will be increased prices of products, of food products in particular, because of the higher prime cost, and those countries will win. The state policy of which will be aimed at supporting domestic producers. We can see cancellation of excise duties in some countries of the European Union for domestic producers. They have some compensatory mechanism. They introduced some restrictions. And it should be mentioned that 3 years ago, we also accepted additional excise duties for our goods. Yes, we will still speak on that. We will definitely speak on what the government could do. Yes, but it's obvious that in the global markets, the cost will be rising, but we should note it that though the agricultural sector in Ukraine is a large exporter, but we are not a game changer in the global markets. Therefore, we do have some limitations in terms of getting a normal price, a good price, not related to our prime cost. We've been talking about successes, so I think that our products and our prices are not related to the prime cost. They are not elastic. And that's what the current situation is. That's our status quo. We are in the middle of the spring sowing campaign. We have got some shortage of fertilizers, but generally the campaign is going on. You know, we used to produce about 2 million tons of fertilizers in Ukraine, but now, due to some military considerations, the amount has reduced significantly, and that's why we have a shortage of fertilizers. Even before the beginning of the spring campaign, we faced this problem of shortage, and actually, I would say that lower amounts of fertilizers have been applied to fields. which means that if we speak about the yield of crops, it will be more expensive for us to plant crops and to get the yield, and the yield will also be much lower because of the reduced
Так,
amount of
звичайно, ми
fertilizers.
використовуємо
Well, definitely, if we do not
пропоную
apply
нові
fertilizers, this means
розуміємо, що
that
ми
the yield could be
але
lower. But
слід
we should
розуміти,
also take
що
it into
фактично дуже
account
критичні
that there are a
фактори,
number of
які у
other
нас є,
factors,
це є погодні
like
фактори.
weather conditions,
Вже
and
говорилось з приводу
we
того,
have already
що
been discussing
є
it.
доволі
There are
непогані
quite good
запаси вологи у продуктивній сфері ґрунту.
reserves of
Це є плюс,
moisture
але
in
ніхто не
soil, but
знає,
nobody
який зимою буде
knows
у нас
what the further
пройде
situation is
весна до
going to
кінця,
be,
і який буде
what
літо,
spring is going to
і
be,
скільки
what
опадів
summer is
буде.
going to
Тому
be, how
що
much precipitation we
пам'ятаємо
will have,
південь,
because we
пам'ятаємо
remember the
посуху,
droughts in
пам'ятаємо
the
те,
south, we remember the
що
fact that
фактично там майже був знищений
all the
врожай на півдні
harvest in the
України.
south of the country was
Тому
almost not
погода
there,
у
was almost
вигляді
fully destroyed.
гарних
That's why
плюсів може
weather in the
компенсувати
form of
цю
good rain could
недостачу
actually
цих
compensate for the
продуктивних
shortage of
факторів.
fertilizer
Як ви
supply. So it all
господарство
depends on
порівнюємо?
weather conditions.
Зима для українців
Well,
була
winter has
досить
been really harsh and
важкою,
severe
тому
for
будемо
Ukrainians, so
сподіватися,
let's
що
hope
погода
that
нам
the weather will
вирішить
compensate for
приносить
that in the
трошки більше
summertime.
полегшення, ніж вона це зробила взимку. Дякую
Good,
вам дуже
thank you.
за те, що ви
Thanks for
змалювали цю картину. І,
describing the status
власне,
quo,
зараз
and now I would like to go over
відповідь
to
державних політик
the state
на
policies
кризу, на війну і на ті
in the
виклики, з
context of the
якими стикаються
crisis, the
українські
war, and the
сектори,
threats
українські
Ukrainian sectors,
компанії.
the companies are
Ми вже
faced with.
почули, що
We have already
якщо
had
аграрія
that
вартість
in the
зросте там
agrarian
відсотків на
sector, the
20,
prime
то
cost will
найскладніше може
increase
вплинути
by
на
10 or
ціни на продукти
20%.
харчування.
So how
Це
far
знову
can
більше
this
питання
affect the
відкрите,
prices of
зважаючи на
food? This is still an
те,
open
наскільки
question because it will
довго
depend on how long
триватиме
the
період
period of
високих
high
цін на
prices of
пальне, та
fuel will
наскільки аграрії мають оцей
stay,
запас
and
міцності, про який говорив пан
how
Олег.
many
Але це
reserves
залежить
our
також від
agrarians have. But it also
любої
depends
практики
on the
реакції Центрального
reaction
банку.
of the central
Володимир, будь
banks.
ласка,
So
розкажи
please,
нам, як
Volodymyr, could you
Національний
tell
банк,
us
які
what are
інструменти
the
він може
tools that the National
застосувати
Bank of
для
Ukraine may
того, щоб
use to
кризу цю
mitigate the
поменшити
consequences
та
of the
трошечки
crisis,
демпфувати
to
та
somehow
зробити її
make it
більш і
milder and
для
more moderate
людей,
both
і
for
для
people and for
бізнесу?
companies?
Дякую.
Well,
Ну,
thank you for the question.
в принципі, реакція вже
I
була.
would say
Тобто,
that the National
фактично, в
Bank
нас
has already
сформувалася знову
reacted to
лікова
that
ставка в
because you
березні.
remember
Національний банк
what happened to the policy
залишив
rate.
її на
We
надмірному
did
рівні.
not change it in March.
Достатньо цікава була, не те, що
Well,
цікава,
we
але достатньо очікувана позиція
had it
Міжнародного
from the
валютного фонду,
International
який вони
Monetary
World Economic
Fund
Outlook
in
оприлюднили,
their World
що
Economic
в принципі
Outlook
це є класичним
that
шоком пропозиції.
this is a classical
В теорії
um,
він має загасувати
supply,
сам по
and in
собі
theory,
після того, як
after
ціни досягнуть
prices
нового
go to a new
рівня.
level, after
Відповідно,
prices reach a new level,
інфляція на високій базі
the inflation rate
зійде на
will
рівне
be
нуль.
leveled down. So
Що
this is according to
має,
the classical theory.
однак,
But
також
it was
зауважували,
also mentioned
що
in the report
все
that
залежить від
it
того, наскільки
depends to a major
під
extent
контролем
on
будуть
how
інфляційні очікування.
controllable
Тобто
are the
ця
inflation
інфляція не стала
expectations, because otherwise
самопідшивлюючим
the
процесом,
inflation
не
may
розкрутилися інфляційні спираль,
uh,
і центральні банки
transform
будуть
into the inflation spiral, and then the
мають на це
central
реагувати.
banks will have to respond to
Тому,
that. But they
звичайно, що готового рішення
have to
поки
do with
немає. У
prevention,
нас
definitely. We
комітет
don't have a
фінансової
ready-made solution,
політики через 2
and we will
тижні.
have a meeting in 2 weeks
Однак
at our committee that
у
will discuss
Національного
this
банку є
issue
не
in the
один
internal
інструмент,
team.
у
But the
нього є
National Bank
комплекс
has not just one
інструментів
tool,
монетарної
but a set of
політики.
tools related to the monetary
Зокрема, є
policy.
опція
In particular, we have such option as
відтермінувати далі цикл
delaying this
пом'якшення і не знижувати
cycle
облікову
of
ставку до
mitigation,
ще
which means that we
очікувалося
will
раніше,
keep
або
the
навіть її підвищувати,
rate
якщо
over a longer
загроза
period of
того,
time,
що
or will even
інфляція
make it higher
закріпиться на
in
високих
case there is
рівнях
a threat
або
that
не
inflation
буде
will be fixed at higher
розвертатися
level,
інфляційна
or
тенденція на горизонті політики.
in some other
Інфляція
cases, if the
не наблизиться до
inflation does
5%,
not go
то
down and
звичайно,
does
що
not
можна
reach
розглядати підвищення
5%,
облікової
then
ставки. Однак у нас ще є важливий
we could
інструмент,
actually
це
consider the option of raising
стійкість.
the accounting rate.
Частина
But we
нашого
have
інструментарію
another
це
tool which is sustainability of the currency market, which does not mean that we are going to stabilize the course at a certain level. No, it will be changing and fluctuating. However, will respond, I mean, the exchange rate, but we'll really responding to the fluctuations that we will see throughout the day. And we will try to hold the expectations under control. It seems to me that the picture is frozen. Is it my problem? Problem on my side? No, the problems are on Volodymyr's side. All right, thank you. So let's hope that Volodymyr will get back to us because his internet connection will become better. Maybe we'll still wait just 1 second. Okay, so Oleh, let me address you. We have already heard from the National Bank of Ukraine. They think that probably they will even need to increase the accounting rate for businesses, which is not the best forecast. But on the other hand, keeping the exchange rate of hryvnia instead of devaluation will still mean that it will be easy for you to buy raw materials or to buy anything in the foreign markets. What do you think on that? Let us focus on this and let's speak in detail about what the government can actually do. But I can see that Volodymyr is back. But Volodymyr, I will get back to you and let us listen now to Oleh. So what could and what should the government do to support you? Because the agricultural sector is really something that is important for Ukraine. So what could be done for the agrarians to have their life facilitated and simplified in a way? Well, the Verkhovna Rada introduced amendments to legislation which secured this excise duty for fuel at the level which is the highest among all the countries of Europe. We analyzed this excise duty rate in different countries. Some countries never have excise duties for agricultural sector, and this is their form of indirect support. In some countries, this excise duty rate is lower, so we think that now it's high time that the government acted and reduced the amount or the rate of this excise duty. We understand that we have state budget deficit and there is a problem with debts and we are highly dependent on IFIs and donors. But anyway, those things could be used as tools that could help somehow reduce those risks. Also, it is really important for agrarians to provide sufficient amounts of fertilizers. This is something I've already mentioned. We've got about 1 million tons, but our level of consumption is about 4 million tons. So this will mean that we will need to import a lot from abroad, and definitely the prices will be higher. We will have to be dependent on the exchange rate. Therefore, agrarians think that it's worth canceling export duty, which is now about 5%. But even these high 5% would be a good reimbursement for the conditions in which people have to work. And also logistics is something which is very important. We've been talking about supporting Ukrainian railways, about the deficit of money and poor financial condition of Ukrzaliznytsia or Ukrainian railways. But taking into account the overall geopolitical situation, we think that unfortunately now it's not the right time to raise the prices for transportation of agricultural goods by the railway. now the cargo fleet of Ukrainian railways is shrinking, and actually the goods that we transport in bulk has the highest tariff for transportation, even higher than for the transportation of building mixtures, construction mixtures, or metallurgical products. So we think that the railways should provide preferential approach for agrarians, because otherwise we have the highest tariff for transportation. So these are three major components I would single out as the ones that could actually level down the negative effect that we can currently see. But the question is still open. How often will the crisis last? And definitely, it also depends on how long after the crisis is over we will need to get the situation stabilized. Well, thank you, Oleh. Let me now get back to Natalia Kolesnichenko. So, Natalia, based on what you have already analyzed, what were the options for state policies, the options of response that you found in the practices that you analyzed? Well, so far I've got I can single out only several practices that have been implemented. As Oleh has mentioned, some countries reduced the duty VAT for fuel, like Poland or Spain, when they are considering not VAT but excise duty reduction in the markets, in the domestic markets. And another option, but the governments of the European countries are speaking about it only very carefully. It's about certain standards as far as the amount of fuel that is going to be allocated per person and per household is. And the Danish government even urges people not to use cars to get to the workplace, because that will reduce the demand for fuel and could theoretically curb rapid increase in fuel prices that we can see throughout the world. So it's also an option. And there is another option, but unfortunately we won't be able to apply it in Ukraine. This is the tax for on extra profits of energy companies, because we don't process oil inside the country and we don't have those extra profits. Vice versa, our companies do feel that there is some shortage of money. The financial results are not that good. The profitability rate is not that good. Therefore, for us, this option is less likely. But to get back to supporting agrarians, I would say that we would need to expand the 579 program to expand its coverage, focusing on agrarians. It is already valid for agrarians, but maybe we could introduce some specific measures for agrarians, because this program is mostly the one related to circulating floating assets. The money is spent mainly on support and not on investment, in spite of the preferential terms of lending. But companies do need this budget support, so it all needs to be transparent, and the rules should be the same for everyone. We should probably give more money, allocate more money to this company, or we should urge companies to apply for the support for them to be able to do the sowing campaign, to deal with their soil. And this will help us not just to increase production, but this will be a good inflation curbing event. Thank you, Natalia. And another Natalia Shpygotska, I know that you do analytical researches for Ukrainian railways. So what do you think about Ukrzaliznytsa's tariffs? Well, Oleh has already mentioned that cargo
transportation and the fact that the prices were raised for cargo transportations helped to somehow compensate for the losses coming from passenger transportations. So this was a certain mechanism aimed at reimbursement, and tariff rise may have an additional negative impact on export-oriented goods. Therefore, the government has not yet passed a decision on a decision to increase cargo transportation fees. However, we can see the first steps towards compensation of the losses coming from passenger transportations. We saw that at the beginning of this year, the government approved the mechanism, which is something like public service obligation mechanism that cannot which was not there in 2025, but so far we do not understand whether this is the mechanism that will still remain over a long period of time. But this is the first step to provide one-time support to the company. We saw that there was some support coming to Ukrainian railways in 2022 at the beginning of the war, then in 2025 when the country was trying to compensate for the losses of the Ukrainian railways. And this means some transition to more sustainable funding. And we've got about 60 million hryvnias. This is the budget approved for 2026 for the Ukrainian railways, but it is not enough to really ensure stable operation of the company. And we should take into account CapEx, capital expenditures, which include recovery and restoration of the company after active attacks on the part of the aggressor country. And we can see that since 2025, there have been increased attacks on trains, on depots, on terminals, which led to extra costs. And we should also remember about two backlogs, which are about the capex to be spent on the deteriorating car and compartment fleet. So definitely the risks are there for the Ukrainian railways, and I cannot say that the problem is really fixed, but probably something has already been done. They started doing something, and maybe this issue will be fixed in some other ways. Maybe there will be a harmonization of cargo tariffs, as mentioned by the Ministry of Economy earlier. So we will see what happens. Thank you. Unfortunately, the sound was very bad. Sorry for that. Thank you,
Дякую дуже,
Natalia.
Наталя. Я думаю, що ми
I think
пройшли
that
вже
we have
досить багато
gone
питань,
through a number of
проаналізували
questions. We have
вплив воєнної
analyzed
грані на
the
українську
impact
економіку,
of the war in
українських
Iran on
аграріїв.
the
Я
Ukrainian
закликаю
economy and
всіх, хто
Ukrainian
зараз нас
agrarians.
слухає,
And
будь
I'm
ласка,
urging all those who are
задавайте ваші
listening to us,
питання в
please
чаті
feel
Q&A. У
free to
нас є
ask
15 хвилин
your
приблизно
questions in the Q&A
часу для того, щоб на них
section.
відповісти.
We still have 15
Поки
minutes
ви
to
задаєте
answer
свої питання,
those
пишете
questions. And
відповіді,
while you are writing
повернутися
your
до того,
questions,
до
let me
чого
get
хотіла
back
повернутися,
to what I promised
коли
to
свій
go
виступ
back to
завершив
after
Володимир,
Volodymyr's
до
speech.
впливу
So this is the
інтегрального
impact of the
банку
war
Російської Федерації.
of Iran
Я одразу
on
скажу, що це
Russia's
така з
economy.
мого боку трошки
Well,
авантюра. Ми не
we
просили
did not actually
спікерів
ask our
відповідати на ці
speakers
питання, але я
to
бачу, що
answer this
вони
question, but I can see
виникають,
that this question
і якщо
is
можливо
raised all the time.
хтось
So
із
if
вас
any
може
of you could
прокоментувати,
actually comment
які є канали впливу
about
в
the
Ірані на російську економіку,
channels
я думаю, що це буде цікаво багатьом нашим
impact in the war in
слухачам.
Iran on the
Володимир
Russian
вже
economy, this is going to be
торкнувся
of interest for
трошки
our
цього
speakers. So
впливу.
Volodymyr has partly
Можливо,
touched
це
upon
може
this.
трошки
Maybe you could speak
розширити.
about that in a more detailed way.
Ну, як я вже казав, ми бачили,
Well,
що
as
в січні
mentioned, in January and
в економіці
February,
Російської Федерації
in the economy of the Russian
накопичувались
Federation,
суттєві
there were
проблеми.
already major problems.
Але їм
However,
стало трохи
now
легше з
they find it
урахуванням того, що
easier
війни
to
survive because
зросли.
the
Це, звичайно, що
prices for export increased,
неприємний фактор.
which is an unfavorable factor for
Звичайно, що
us.
наші, скажімо так,
Definitely, our
санкції,
sanctions
які наші Збройні Сили до них
imposed
застосовують,
on
не
the
дають
Russian
скористатися цим
Federation
повною
still
мірою.
do not allow them to use this
Це ж дуже
improvement
добре.
to the
Ну і крім
fullest
того,
extent
враховуючи
possible,
те,
which is good.
що в
And
економіці
taking
Росії
into account
вже
the fact
знижені
that
основні
the
фонди
main
і
assets
нам видно,
already
що
depreciated in the Russian
неможливо буде
economy, and we can see that
видати
they
допомогу у відповідь на зростаючу кон'юнктуру. Тут в них
fail to
не варіант. Тому дійсно
increase
фінансовий ресурс у них
production
виникає. Це в довгостроковій
in
перспективі
response
не
to the
вирішує
changes in the
проблем,
market situation. So
однак це є
it will
неприємний фактор,
overall not
який дозволить
solve
їм
all their problems, but that
триматися
is a
більше
favorable
на плаву і
component
фінансувати
which
війну.
will help them to stay afloat over a long period of
Да, мені
time and
просто
finance
здається,
the war.
плюс для нас
And that is what I
санкції
think
це
as
не
well. It
пального,
seems to
це
me
також
that
система ціни пального, які закуповують
increased
на сили України.
fuel
Олеже, чи ви
prices
можете
will
прокоментувати,
also
здорово продовжили
mean
останні підтримки,
the
великі виробники були
that Russia will gain more.
хіба
Could
не
you
вторгне природний
speak
газ і теж
about the story with
виробляють фермери
fertilizers?
тут.
This
А
story
наскільки
related to
вони
Belarus. So,
домінуючий на ринок, наскільки не є
are they back to the
проблемою
market?
попит
Is there any
збільшився?
demand for their
Ну
fertilizers?
там
Well,
річ у
the whole
тому,
point there
що,
is that,
по-перше,
first of all,
американці
the Americans have now
зняли
lifted
санкції із
the sanctions they had
білкарів
imposed on
Білорусі-Калію.
Belkan.
І, власне
And
кажучи, це також не
this is
дуже
not a good
гарний
thing
момент
that they
для
did
взагалі для
because it
нас,
has
тому
a
що
negative impact on
певною
us.
мірою до війни, якщо
Before the
дивитися
war, if we
інформацію
analyze the
до
pre-war
цієї
situation,
війни, то в дійсності, що білоруські
Belarus
добрива
fertilizers
експортувалися
were
до Сполучених
exported to
Штатів,
the
також
US
експортувалися до Китаю. Ну і росіяни,
and
звичайно,
also
що є
to
головними
China.
виробниками цих
And
добрив. Але,
still, I have to
власне
tell
кажучи, їхні
that Russia
маршрути
also gained from that,
машинопостачання,
but
звичайно,
their
що вони
supply
не
channels
надходять в тій мірі, в якій вони могли
are not
надходити
used
до
to the full
країн
if
Європейського
we
Союзу.
speak about
Тобто
supply
це
to the
ближче
European countries.
близький,
Mostly they
близький схід,
supply goods
частково.
to the
Хоча,
Middle East.
зрештою, в 23-му році, до речі,
Though
ми це
I have to
чули
tell you that
польські
in the year
фермери блокували
2027, when there was
нафтогонку
this blockade
з
by the
одного
Polish
боку
farmers on
вони
the Polish border,
блокували
so on the
хормузівську
one hand they
нафтогонку
blocked the border, but on the other
добрив
hand they
з Білорусі зайшло на територію
they
Європейського
helped
Союзу.
1 million
Європейський Союз
tons of
зараз
fertilizers from
перестав
Belarus to enter the
інтересуватися.
territory of the European Union.
Ну, по тому, що ми знаємо, по
Judging by
тому, що ми
what
маємо
we
інформацію,
know,
звичайно, що російського сліду в добривах, які
definitely
в нас постачаються, їх немає.
there is
І
no Russian trace, so
європейські
to say, in the
країни, вони також
fertilizers
до
that
цього
are
дуже
supplied to
сильно
Ukraine. And I would say
ставляться
that the European countries are
критично.
also very careful about not
Не
having
дивиться,
this Russian
власне,
trace because
російські
they
добрива.
don't think that it's worth
Олеже,
buying
не назвіть,
Russian
будь ласка, ім'я, задавайте питання
traces,
в нашому
Russian
Q&A, і
fertilizers. Oleg,
всім,
so
хто
here is the
згадує, будь
question for
ласка,
you in the
додавайте свої
Q&A.
запитання в Q&A.
And please, I'm
Запитання від
encouraging the
Національного
participants
банку
to
від Ольги
also
Трінча. Запитання
ask your
таке.
questions. Here
Наскільки
is the question
зменшується
from the
обсяг
National
паливів
Bank.
пшениці та кукурудзи при
If
скороченні внесень добрив на
fertilizers are
10%, тобто на
applied
10%
10%
менше добрив,
less, what
що
will
буде при
happen
крайністю.
to the
І
yield of
питання,
wheat
яка
and corn?
максимально
And what is
допустима
the
ціна на
maximum
добрива для того,
permissible
щоб
price
не
of
знизити
prices
закупівлю
for you to
з
be able
поточного
not to
року?
reduce their supply and procurement in this year?
Вас не
We
чути.
cannot hear you, Ola?
Олеже, ви на м'юті.
Да.
Yes,
Дякую.
sorry for that.
В нас в поточному
This
році
year,
слід
well,
розуміти,
we
що
should
питання навіть
understand
не в
that
ціні
this
стоїть. У нас в
year the
поточному році
price is
питання стоїть
not the
у
major
фізично
factor. We're
наявній
talking
волозі
about the
землі як
actual
такій.
availability of
Тому
fertilizers as
що
such,
ми
because
ввійшли
we have
вже
already
в першому
started
році з
the spring
дефіцитом
campaign having the
аміачних селітрів на рівні
deficit of
200 тисяч тонн. І
200 tons
тобто
of
рахуючи, що ми
ammonium,
загалом
and
споживаємо
well,
4 мільйони, то 200 тисяч тонн
200
це є,
tons is
власне,
quite
суттєва
a
частина.
lot, and this is
У
a
нас
major
немає
part of the 4
власного
million that I
виробництва.
mentioned.
Тобто Остхем, який
Therefore,
виробляв, і Одеський припортовий, які виробляли
the point
орієнтовно 2
is
мільйони
that we
тонн.
had some
Ми зараз
facilities that
контролюємо свої
produced
виробництва,
ammonium
і
and
дійсно
nitrate,
лишилося у
about
нас
2
абсолютно
million tons, but
незалежно
now
1 мільйон.
they have
З
terminated their
приводу
production, and we have got
вартості,
only
то тут
production at the level of
потрібно
about 1
орієнтуватися
million. As
на
far as export is
загальну
concerned, and as far
собівартість
as the prime cost is concerned,
всього
so
продукту. Якщо ми там
we
підв'язуємо його зменшення,
should
наприклад,
understand that
10%,
if the
ну,
reduction in the
очікувано, що у
application of
нас
fertilizers is about
більше
10%,
дешевий, ніж
um,
там
it
в області
depends on
дронів буде
what kind of
застосовувати,
fertilizer it is, and if it is comprehensively
то такий
applied
прямо
with a
пов'язки
specific
по
ingredient,
рівню
so
врожайності.
there will be no
Воно
direct
виключно виходить
linkage to
по математиці, да, по
the
математичним
yield.
і економічним показникам,
Because it
фактично.
depends on the
Тому я
ingredient and on the amount
повторюся
of
ще раз,
ingredient
що
in a
великі
specific ingredient
фосфати
in the
можуть бути
fertilizer.
погодні
So let me
умови,
repeat it once again
які
that this
зможуть
is not a
компенсувати
critical
недостачу
problem
добрив
because the
фермерам.
weather conditions could somehow compensate for the
Дякую,
shortage of
Олег. І наступне
fertilizers. Thank you,
питання
Oleh. And
представляє нас від
here
Юрія
is question
Прозорова
from Yuri Prozorov
до
for
Володимира
Volodymyr
Лопушинського.
Lepushynskyi.
Юрій,
So
дякую за цікаві
he is
інсайти
expressing
і
gratitude
запитує,
for
чи допоможе
great
перехід на
insights,
євро
and
в Україні
the question
допомагати
is, well,
знизити інфляцію
transition
до
to
середнього
euro in
європейських
Ukraine help reduce inflation for it to reach
Коротка
EU
відповідь
rates? My
ні.
short answer is no.
Зараз
However,
перехід на євро для
now
нас
transition to
не
euro is
актуальний.
not
Треба
something, or
спочатку
switching to
вступити в
euro is
ЄС,
not something that is relevant
потім
for us. First, we
виконати
need to exceed the
критерії,
EU,
потім думати
meet
про
the
лист.
requirements, and then we will be
Тому,
thinking when we switch
але
to
сам по собі
euro. But
автоматичний перехід
automatic
на
transition
євро
to
не
euro
знижує
will not
інфляцію,
lead
він
to reduction
позбавляє
of inflation,
країну від
and does
незалежної монетарної
it will
політики. Відповідно,
just
інфляція
lead to the
не
situation
глобально
when
там на
um,
внутрішню інфляцію стає центральному
there
банку
will be a need, and
важче.
it will
Воно
become
фактично
more
ламає
difficult to
економіку.
respond to
Тому незалежна
internal
монетарна політика це те, що
inflation because we will
варто
be deprived of
зберегти,
the independent
допоки
monetary
ми не
policy. So, international
консолідуємо
monetary
візний
policy is
цикл
something that we should
з
really be
циклом єврозони
appreciating
достатній.
until
Але
we
це питання
also
для
fully
довгих
align
лекцій
our
і дискусій.
markets with the EU markets.
Але
Дуже
дякую.
цікаво буде колись
Okay,
слухати
so
довгу лекцію дискусію, але
otherwise we may
знаєте, в
have a long
такому
discussion of
реально
that. It would be
практичному її
interesting to,
застосуванні.
by the way,
Коли
listen to this
члени
long
ЄС,
lecture
ми
or
будемо
discussion,
розповідати серйозний перехід
because it's of
з євро
interest how we become a
до
member of the
єврозони,
EU, and then we are
де ці
considering
дискусії
the point
починаються
of switching
набагато
to euro.
серйозніше, ніж зараз.
I
Я
don't
не
see
бачу
any
більше
other
питань
hands in
в
the
Q&A в
raised
чаті.
or any
Я
questions in the
дякую всім
Q&A or in the
колегам,
chat. So let
які
me express my
долучилися
gratitude to
сьогодні
all
до
the
нашої
colleagues who have been
дискусії.
our panelists and who have
Я
joined us in
закликаю
our
всіх
discussion today.
звернути
Let me
увагу
draw
на те,
attention to the
що
fact
війна в
that the
Ірані
war in Iran
негативно впливає
has
на,
a negative
в
impact
тому числі,
on
наші
our
збройні
armed
сили. Будь
forces of
ласка, підтримуйте
Ukraine.
їх, будь
So
ласка,
please
донатьте, будь
donate.
ласка, не
Please do not stop
зупиняйтеся
in that.
на БНР, на
Donate
автівки, на
for fuel,
дрони,
for drones. Support the
підтримуйте,
armed forces
підтримуйте
of
хлопців
Ukraine with
чим
whatever you
і
can
як
in
ви можете.
whatever way is
Тихого
possible.
вам
Stay safe.
дня
Have a good
сьогодні
evening.
і
And
надалі.
thanks a
Дякую
lot
дуже, що
for joining
приєдналися.
us today.